Previously, in Aristomenes' Insurgent epic Hero, we learned of the story, the legend of Aristomenes. He led his people in rebellion against the Spartans in the Second Messenian War in the 7th century BCE. He never succeeded in his lifetime to throw off the yoke of Spartan control, and the Messenians had to wait until the 4th century BCE for their freedom. But after his death, legends grew up around the story of Aristomenes, and perhaps other extraneous myths and tropes coalesced around him. All this leads to the question, did Aristomenes even exist? Was he a historical figure, a war leader around whom so many more or less fantastical stories arose, and upon whom the Messenians projected their nation's pride, but nonetheless a real man? Or is there not even a kernel of truth? It's a question that has never been definitively answered, and probably never will. Bear in mind that some have even doubted the historicity of the Messenian wars themselves. To some scholars, the history of Messenia prior to its 4th century independence from Sparta should be seen as nothing but pseudo-history, a national myth created by a formerly enslaved and illiterate people. For this point of view, see Lionel Pearson's 1962 paper, The Pseudo-History of Messenia and its Authors. In Pearson's words, the invention of ancient history for new nations, such as Messene was, has obvious attractions, and it is not an attraction which has grown weaker with the passage of time. In modern times also, new nations are anxious to discover and establish a history of their people, which will give them a place in the history of medieval or even ancient times. The result cannot be arrived at without some creative writing. By extension, Pearson argues, Aristomenes is no more a real figure than, say, Achilles or Hector, and that Rhiannos's epic, which featured Aristomenes, is not an account of the war any more than the Iliad is an account of the Trojan War. But more recently, Susan Alcock has sought to overturn such thinking. The Messenians, even powerless under Spartan rule, had the ability to remember and promulgate their own versions of the past, dismissing phrases such as pseudo-history or false invention. What now requires explanation is how these versions, those memories, were transformed with freedom's radical restructuring. But let's return to our subject. In these videos, we're less interested in Messenia and its history per se, but rather in the nation's hero Aristomenes himself. What of him? In 1930, L.R. Sherrow wrote, "We may readily grant that at the time of the Messenian restoration, some figure was needed to serve as a focus for popular loyalty and devotion. If there had been no national hero of sufficient stature in the tales of the nation's past to serve this purpose, one would have had to have been invented. But there is no convincing reason for assuming that such a figure was not available in the Messenian tradition, or that Aristomenes was merely a product of propagandist ingenuity. But while it is entirely probable that a Messenian leader by the name of Aristomenes actually lived, it is idle to attempt to determine with certainty how much of a historical foundation, if any, there was for the various tales of his exploits as narrated by Pausanias. I would doubt one can say much more about Aristomenes' historicity than that. What we have, however, are the tales, thanks almost entirely to Pausanias. Aristomenes is one of the lesser-known figures from the classical past, but he's a figure whom in his own way keeps emerging, and in whom people keep finding something of interest or relevance to their times. In the stories of Aristomenes, we see how a nation has constructed a hero, a figurehead, a hero whose story reflects a nation's sense of self and pride. That is what often happens. Around a kernel of truth, the genuinely brave or remarkable feats of a man or woman, or sometimes just the dignified stoicism of an everyman in the face of exceptional peril, around this kernel, other tales and stories coalesce and attach themselves. Over time, a hero emerges and a legend is born. L.R. Sherrow, from whom our last quotation came, was writing in the 1930s. At a time when European, indeed world, war was looming, and also at a time when nationalism and nations myth-making were reaching their darkest and most extreme point. It was around that same time, in the late 1930s, that F.L. Lukas wrote his dramatic poem Messene Redeemed. In his introductory note, Lukas writes, "These pages were written in the summer of 1938 as the encroaching shadows of Nazi Germany darkened over Europe, and revised in the winter of 1939-40 when the shame of the Peace of Munich had been redeemed by the courage of September 1939. Lukas's poem flits between various points in Messenia's history, or pseudo-history if you're so inclined to call it. The frame is set in 4th century Messenia, as men recite stories from their past, with tales of the First and Second Messenian Wars, a dramatization perhaps of the development of the national myth. Aristomenes features prominently in such inset accounts. Most notably, Lukas gives the following speech to Aristomenes as he leads his people out from their mountain refuge at Ira for the final time into exile. Our race is broken, splinters of a nation, defenseless fragments of a shattered sword. The hills we loved hold their eternal station, but we pass scattered through the earth abroad. But no, the hills we loved shall march before us. Wherever kindles some tall sunset cloud, there shall Ithome still rise towering o'er us. Once more shall Ira lift her crags uncowed. We shall not drink again the springs of Nida, nor rest by Pamesus at evenfall. Yet all Messenia's streams, till we have freed her, flow in the hearts that hearken to her call. It is not hills beloved, nor plains, nor rivers fashion a nation. It is the eternal pride that even in exile's heart still beats and quivered, remembering her for whom their comrades died.